I froze when my wife's lover arrived at the company couple's dinner and kissed her in front of everyone, as if I weren't there, as if nothing between us had ever existed. The room spun, but I stood firm, stood up silently, and left, taking only my dignity with me. And there, in that exact moment, I realized that love doesn't die all at once. It dies slowly, in small betrayals, in swallowed silences, in averted glances, in forgotten promises, and, finally, in kisses that shouldn't happen, but do. The image of him bending over her, as if he were the only man present, as if she were his wife and not mine, seared me with a dry, soundless pain that only those who have been betrayed know. It's the scream you hear inside, the blood that boils and doesn't escape. The entire room stopped. There were murmurs, glances, a general embarrassment, but no one dared to say a word. And she said nothing. She stood there, motionless, as if she was undecided between running after me or continuing to cling to the choice she had already made long before that kiss happened. In the days that followed, her silence hurt more than the kiss itself. Because I discovered it wasn't just betrayal. It was an abandonment built on silence. It was a decision engineered while I believed we were still building something together. When she finally came after me, her eyes didn't hold regret, they held despair. Because the other, the great lover, the man who seemed to have plucked her from the arms of marital boredom, didn't want commitment. He wanted adventure. She traded 30 dinners made with love for 3 nights of euphoria. She traded a life she'd built for something that didn't even have a name. And now she came to me, saying she'd made a mistake, that she'd gotten confused, that she thought she deserved more, and now she realized that more was an illusion. She wanted to go back. He said he missed me. That she felt alone. That she felt surrounded by memories of us in every corner of the house. That the pillow still smelled of my perfume even months later. But there was something in her that told me she wasn't regretting what she'd done. It was just the pain of not having a happy ending with the other. It was the disappointment of a broken illusion. It wasn't love. It was emptiness. And that, for me, was even worse. I didn't leave in anger. I didn't curse, I didn't yell, I didn't slam the door. I simply didn't want to stay any longer. Because you don't need a scandal to show you've been hurt. Sometimes, the greatest cry of pain is silence. And my silence said it all, I loved you. I chose you every day, even on the days you didn't deserve it. I was loyal when no one else saw it. I defended you even from myself. I forgave you 1,000 times for small gestures. And you, when you had the chance to protect me from the world, handed me over to public scorn. There is no greater humiliation than being betrayed before the eyes that respect you. And the worst wasn't being betrayed, it was being discarded so naturally. As if my presence there were an inconvenience to the new phase of her life. As if my love were a piece off the board. As if I were an echo that should have been silenced by now. She cried when she realized I wouldn't give in. She said I was cold, different. And I said, no, I'm not cold. I'm burned. Because some things can't be fixed. There are trusts that, once broken, there's no glue in the world that can hold the pieces together. And her betrayal was exactly that, the destruction of something I cared for zealously. It took me a while to understand, but I did. Love that needs to be begged for isn't worth it. And so I moved on. I had difficult nights, identity crises, moments of self-doubt. I wondered where I went wrong, if I was absent, if I failed to notice, if I failed as a man, as a husband. But one day, everything stopped hurting. And when the pain subsided, I began to remember who I was before I felt inadequate. And then I met a new love. A calm gaze. A loyal heart. A laugh that healed me just by existing. It didn't come like a storm, it came like a breeze. It didn't promise the world, it offered presence. It didn't ask for anything, it listened to me. It saw me. It touched me lightly, like someone who understands the value of what they hold in their hands. And for the first time in a long time, I felt safe. Not the kind of security based on blind passion, but the security of knowing there was peace there. And peace, I learned, is also a profound form of love. Perhaps the noblest. Because passion fades, desire adapts, but peace remains. It offered me what my ex never understood, tranquility. And I, for the first time, stopped seeking intensity and chose stability. I chose the love that lasts. The love that grows. The love that doesn't betray. And then one day, as always happens in stories that refuse to die, she returned. She returned with her head down. With a different expression on her face. A tired face, overcome by life. She wanted to talk, said she still thought of me. That she saw me in the details of her routine, in the small gestures, in the old shows we watched together. She said no kiss had tasted good since that dinner. That no touch felt meaningful. That no presence filled her. She tried to smile, tried to remember good things, but there was sadness in every attempt. And I listened. Because it no longer hurt. And because listening doesn't mean accepting. When she finished speaking, she apologized once more. And I replied, "Don't apologize anymore. I've already forgiven you." And it was true. I had forgiven her not for her, but for myself. Because carrying hurt weighed more heavily on me than the betrayal. I forgave because I wanted to move on, not carry it. But the moment that defined everything was when I introduced her to my new partner. She smiled, extended her hand. She said she'd heard a lot about her. My new partner responded gracefully. But one look between us was enough for the penny to drop. She understood. She saw. There was no more room. There was no going back. The place that had once been hers now belonged to another woman. And not out of revenge. Not out of pride. But out of deservedness. And it was there, right there, in the face of that simple gesture, that my ex's expression changed. Her eyes welled, her lips trembled, but she stood her ground. She knew there was nothing more to say. That the pain of what is lost by choice is silent. And eternal. She didn't just lose a husband. She lost a home. A place in the world. A future that was being built, and that was destroyed by a decision that, deep down, she knew was wrong. But she made it anyway. Because she thought that secure love was not enough. That calm love was monotonous. That loyalty was a given. And today she knows, nothing is guaranteed. Not even the love of someone who loves you every day, even for no reason. And in the end, all she had was the echo of a name that no longer belonged to her. But there is one thing she never knew, that perhaps she discovered too late. What did I say to my new partner, right after we said goodbye to her that day? What did she see in my eyes that made her certainty crumble? The answer to that lies in the story yet to be told. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any form of betrayal. The stories you'll hear are fictional, but the feelings, they're real. Our purpose is clear, to show how betrayal corrodes, destroys, and leaves scars that not even time can erase. Get ready to dive into a story intense, emotional and shocking. Let it begin, the truth behind the wrong choice. His name was Daniel. He was 37 years old and possessed a presence that didn't immediately catch your eye, but left its mark on those who knew how to look beyond it. He wasn't the most handsome man in the room, nor the most eloquent. But he was the most present. The kind of man who listens with his whole body, who looks you in the eye calmly, as if to say his time was also someone else's. He had worked for 10 years as a project coordinator at a multinational company and was known among his colleagues for his almost uncomfortable honesty, the kind that never knew how to play politics and preferred to stay away from power games. He was proud of his own trajectory, not because it was brilliant, but because it was clean. He came from a simple family, with roots rooted in hard work and the values inherited from a father who woke before the sun and a mother who never allowed dignity to be negotiable. He believed that relationships only work when there is respect, and he carried this through everything, in his work, in his friendships, and, above all, in love. He met Laura at a Sunday lunch at a mutual friend's house. She was the opposite of what he'd always imagined he'd look for. Expansive, witty, with a free laugh and quick wit. She had a contagious energy, the kind that turns any room into a stage just by the way she moved. She came from a different world than his. The only child of a respected doctor and a retired teacher, she grew up surrounded by comfort and high expectations. She graduated in public relations and, over time, became one of the people responsible for organizing social events at the company where Daniel worked, although they wouldn't meet again professionally until years later. At the time they met, Laura was fresh out of a failed relationship that had left her skeptical of promises. Daniel, on the other hand, was almost a romantic out of time. He still believed in sincere declarations and in building something solid. But when they crossed paths at that unpretentious lunch, something aligned in a way neither he nor she could explain. It was as if the noises of the world had fallen silent and only the sound of their connection remained. They began seeing each other frequently, at first among friends, then over increasingly long coffees, until the conversations were endless. Laura laughed at Daniel's unexpected observations, at his way of noticing what no one else saw, like the way she tossed her hair when she was anxious, or how she always pushed the imaginary ring of a fiancé who never existed. Daniel was captivated by her intensity, by the way she talked about the future as if anything were possible, by the way her presence filled the space. It was a love that seemed to grow silently, with strong roots and unspoken promises. When he asked her to be his girlfriend, he didn't need to make a speech. He simply held her hand firmly and said he wanted to walk beside her. And Laura, for the first time in a long time, felt she didn't need to pretend to be less intense to be accepted. 2 years later, they were married. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Their closest friends and families gathered in a discreet garden, where what was celebrated wasn't the party, but the commitment. They moved in together in an airy apartment on the 3rd floor of an old but characterful building. Daniel insisted on building a small bookshelf with his own hands, despite Laura's protests that he couldn't even use a drill. They laughed a lot that afternoon, amidst crooked boards and lost screws, and ended the day lying on the floor, exhausted, their faces covered in dust and their eyes shining with happiness. That, for him, was what mattered, being together, sharing their days, building with their own hands not only their furniture, but their lives. Time passed. A routine established itself with their emotional rituals. She loved making breakfast on Saturdays, and he made a point of picking up fresh flowers for the kitchen at least twice a month. There were difficult days, of course. As in any real relationship, there was fatigue, disagreements, and missteps. But the love was there, like a low flame that didn't burn, but warmed. Daniel wasn't one for big surprises, but he was one for small things. He kept the notes she wrote in random drawers. He bought that specific wine she said reminded him of her youthful travels. He remembered dates. And even on the days when she arrived tired and grumpy, he welcomed her with a light kiss and the necessary silence. Laura, for her part, was always seeking movement. She was passionate about people, parties, and the exchange of energy. Sometimes she felt Daniel was too static, too predictable. But that was also what kept her coming back, his predictability was her security. Even if she didn't say it outright, she felt protected in that constant love. Over time, however, she began to question whether comfort wasn't also a form of stagnation. The once lively conversations became more practical exchanges. The lingering kisses became quick. The meaningful dinners gave way to hurried meals between tasks. There were no fights, no shouting, no serious absences. There was just the sneaking in of habit. And with it, doubt. While Daniel clung to the stability of the relationship as a safe haven, Laura began searching for something she couldn't even name. She attended events, dinners, work meetings. She met people. She talked. She laughed. And, little by little, a restlessness arose. She began to look at Daniel as if searching for something she could no longer find. As if the man she loved had become trapped in a past version of himself. But he never spoke of it. He swallowed his questions. He buried his dissatisfaction under a pile of appointments, reports, and rehearsed laughter. Daniel, for his part, noticed the silences but attributed them to fatigue. He believed the phase would pass. And instead of talking, he tried harder. More flowers. More carefully prepared coffee. More presents. But sometimes, the other person's presence isn't enough when they're no longer truly present. Still, there was affection. There were memories. There were attempts. On a long weekend, they traveled to the mountains. They stayed in a small inn, surrounded by trees and a cool breeze. Daniel took a book and a bottle of wine. Laura brought anxiety and a longing she couldn't quite pinpoint. They ate dinner in silence that night. They hiked the trail the next day. They laughed at a goat that escaped the fence. They made love, like they hadn't in a long time. And for a moment, she thought it could still work. That maybe it was just time testing them both. That maybe real life demanded just that kind of persistence. But the doubt didn't go away. And when doubt decides to stay, it digs its way in until it becomes a tenant. Back to his routine, Daniel continued with his small gestures. He sent messages throughout the day. He touched her waist as he passed by the kitchen. He told her he loved her simply, like someone saying, "Good morning," but really meaning, "Stay here." Laura listened, responded, but she no longer felt it. Not like before. And it consumed her. Because she wanted to feel it. She wanted the thrill she'd felt at the beginning. She wanted the desperation of a new touch, the urgency of discovery. But Daniel's love was too calm to be urgent. It was too calm to be new. And that, though it was all she said she wanted, no longer seemed enough. There was a night he prepared a special dinner for no reason at all. He set the table with silverware, lit candles, and played the music they'd danced to at their engagement. Laura arrived later than planned. Her face bore a strange weariness, an absence difficult to name. Daniel pretended not to notice. He smiled, pulled out a chair, and poured the wine. They chatted about trivialities. She laughed politely. When he tried to dance, she gently declined. She said she had a headache. He nodded, cleared the dishes, and washed them himself. That night, he stared at the ceiling for hours. Something inside him ached, but he couldn't name it. And perhaps he never learned that some silences scream much louder than harsh words. Even so, they continued. Because love is also persistence. And Daniel was a man who persisted. Who believed that everything could be resolved with time, with patience, with care. He saw no signs of an end, only signs of fatigue. And for fatigue, he believed there was rest. He didn't know that sometimes what appears to be fatigue is actually surrender in disguise. He didn't know that there were pains that love couldn't heal when the other person had already decided not to be there anymore. And at that moment, in the calm of their shared life, something began to stir behind the scenes of their relationship. Something Daniel hadn't imagined. Something Laura didn't yet fully understand. A choice was being made. A silent rupture that would soon change their lives forever. But for now, everything seemed calm. For now, there was still peace. Over time, Laura's breathing began to drift away from Daniel's rhythm. It was as if they still lived in the same house, slept in the same bed, shared the same tasks, but no longer lived with each other. Daniel, always attentive to details, noticed the distance subtly. Her eyes took longer to meet his, her touch came less frequently, their conversations were truncated, interspersed with silences that, once full of comfort, but now felt full of walls. But he didn't dramatize, didn't demand, he believed that marriages go through phases, and that enduring them was a gesture of love as important as the initial kisses. Laura, on the other hand, felt her heartbeat change, and she wasn't sure if it was guilt, frustration, or just confusion. She was still there, but part of her was gone. There was a growing restlessness, a feeling of suffocation that she couldn't explain. She began to arrive home late frequently, citing meetings, last-minute dinners, unexpected work issues. Daniel believed, not because he was naive, but because he would never have thought she could lie. The first time she considered cheating wasn't when she met another man. It was when she looked in the mirror and no longer recognized herself next to Daniel. When she realized that the vibrant woman within her seemed dormant, buried by routines and expectations. She missed feeling desired, admired, and the center of attention for something other than her professional competence. It wasn't a lack of love. It was an excess of ego, of pride, of wounded vanity. And it was at one of these networking events, between glasses of white wine and lost glances amid tedious speeches, that she met a man who looked at her differently. A look that told her she was still young, still attractive, still a living desire. The conversation began innocently, with subtle compliments and easy laughter. But over time, the meetings became intentional. An untimely coffee, an exchange of messages, a light touch on the arm, a snide comment. Laura knew what she was doing, and at the same time, she told herself she wasn't doing anything. Just filling a space inside her that Daniel, with his predictable sweetness, could no longer reach. The tension between them grew with the details. Daniel could feel her return feeling lighter, as if she'd left something of herself somewhere else. The kisses upon arrival were hurried, the apologies lame, her phone always face down. She had excuses for everything, and he forced himself to believe it, because the alternative was too painful to consider. He preferred to think it was fatigue, the weight of work, life demanding patience. Even when he found new clothes in the closet she claimed to have had for months, even when her perfume changed without explanation, even when she smiled to herself, looking at her phone, he convinced himself it was best not to invade. That love also meant trusting in the other's silence. Laura began avoiding long weekends with him, making excuses to travel alone or with friends. At get-togethers with couples, her impatience was evident. Daniel tried to balance the situation delicately, praising her in public, acknowledging her achievements, trying to rekindle something that, to her, was already smoldering. The problem was that, as good as he was, she no longer felt it. And not feeling it in a relationship with someone so wholesome was worse than being unhappy with someone cruel. The fault, then, wasn't his. It was hers. And that weighed heavily. Because knowing you had a good man at home and still wanting another was a silent, gnawing guilt. Her encounters with the other man intensified. They began in cafes, evolved into secret lunches, and finally, hotel rooms. There were no promises, no future. Only escape. An intoxicating escape from the everyday, from predictability, from the calm she had mistaken for boredom. The other man, unlike Daniel, didn't know her vulnerability. He didn't know her fears, her insecurities, her defeats. He saw her as she wanted to be seen, intense, determined, free. And she plunged into this illusion with hunger, like someone starving for herself. Daniel, in turn, began to break down inside. Her absences became more glaring. He began to notice her schedules, her commutes, her broken patterns. Her phone was locked, her passwords changed, and their intimacy began to fade. He tried to talk a few times, but Laura always said everything was fine, that he was the one insecure, that maybe he needed to trust more. He believed her. But deep inside, something told him it wasn't quite like that. That something was off. Still, he didn't want to invade, didn't want to accuse. Love, for him, was respecting another's space, even when that space begins to exclude you. Then came the company's couples dinner. A traditional event held once a year, where employees and their peers were invited to celebrate the year's results and strengthen bonds. Laura, as one of the organizers, was more involved than ever, taking care of the smallest details. Daniel, despite not enjoying corporate environments outside of work hours, went for her. He wanted to support her, to show they were still together. That night, she looked beautiful. She wore a sober but elegant dress, and there was a sparkle in her eyes he hadn't seen in a long time. He smiled at her when she approached, and even though she didn't receive the same enthusiasm in return, he chose to ignore it. They sat at the table with other colleagues, toasted, chatted, everything seemed to flow perfectly. It was in the middle of the night, while Daniel was talking to a director, that the unexpected happened. The man appeared with confident steps, a relaxed posture, and a smile Daniel didn't recognize. He walked straight to Laura, ignoring all the stares around him. He stopped in front of her and, without hesitation, cupped her face with both hands and kissed her. A guilt-free kiss. A kiss that didn't ask for permission. A kiss that revealed everything. The laughter ceased. The room froze for seconds that seemed eternal. Daniel didn't move. Not out of fear. But because his body refused to react. It was as if his soul had left his body before the shock wore off. He looked at her. And she didn't look back. That's when everything fell apart. There were no explanations, no defenses, no immediate apologies. There was just a gesture. A kiss. A silence. And a truth that everyone understood, even without anyone saying it. Daniel rose from his chair with the serenity of someone who finally understood everything. He grabbed his coat, adjusted his watch, and walked out the front door without looking back. There was no scene. There was no scandal. There was dignity. And pain. So much pain. Laura stood frozen. The other man tried to hide it, but the damage was already done. Some colleagues tried to pretend they hadn't seen, others simply looked away. Daniel walked to the car unhurriedly, as if carrying his own broken heart in his hands. He sat in the driver's seat and remained there, silent, staring at the steering wheel. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply understood. He understood that everything he'd been feeling for months wasn't paranoia. It was real. And that love, when betrayed in broad daylight, leaves no room for doubt. But what Daniel didn't yet know was that behind that betrayal lay something bigger. Something Laura had hidden. Something that would change not only how he viewed what happened, but everything he thought about her, about the other man, and most importantly, about himself. Something that would make her silence, instead of cowardice, seem like something else. Something that awaited him in the next chapter of pain. For days, Laura didn't have the courage to seek him out. She didn't know if it was fear of the answer or shame of her own choice. But the truth was, for the first time in years, she didn't know how to hide what she felt. There was too much damage, too many witnesses, too much silence. And yet, in the solitude of the apartment that now seemed too big for just one person, she revisited every detail, every choice, every word spoken and swallowed. The other man, who once made her feel alive, now seemed distant, cold, and detached. When she asked what they would do from then on, he merely laughed, saying he hadn't agreed on anything beyond what they'd already experienced. He used beautiful words to justify an abandonment that had already been decided even before that kiss. And it was in that moment that Laura knew, what she traded for intensity had no depth. What she sought in another body wasn't desire, it was escape. And what she found after the kiss was the ground. She tried to resist, to hold her ground, but her conscience weighed heavy. And the only person she still wanted to see, was the very person she pushed away. When she finally summoned the courage, she went to the apartment where she shared a room with Daniel. She rang the doorbell with trembling hands, her heart racing, unsure of what to say, unsure if he would open. The door opened hesitantly, and what she found was a man visibly thinner, but with a calm gaze, a serene expression that hurt more than any shout. There was no anger. There was no accusation. There was a kind of emotional exhaustion she couldn't name. She tried to smile, but her lips faltered. She said she needed to talk. He simply stepped aside to let her in. The room was different. More sober, cleaner. Without any of the photos, without a trace of her. She sat on the sofa, he sat opposite, maintaining a distance that spoke more than any words. She began by saying she didn't want justifications, that there were no excuses. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but that she needed him to know she wasn't that woman anymore. That the kiss was a mistake, but the mistake began long before. That the betrayal was just a reflection of a silent distancing. That she was searching outside for what she didn't understand inside. Daniel listened, silent, his eyes fixed on hers, without interrupting, without looking away. She became emotional as she told him how the other man left her, how the spell had faded, how she now saw the value of everything she'd lost. She said she regretted it, that she hated herself for having destroyed the only love that had been strong enough to endure even the hardest days. He remained silent. And then she said, tears already streaming down her face, that if she could go back in time, she would choose him again. That now she knew. That he was the right one. And that there would never be another like him again. Daniel stood up slowly. He walked to the kitchen, got a glass of water, drank it slowly, then returned. He sat down again, and only then did he speak. He said he listened to her, and saw sincerity in her words, but that time was unforgiving to those who took too long to feel. He said he had already granted forgiveness, but that returning it was impossible because he had found another kind of love. A love that didn't make him beg for attention. A love that didn't depend on adrenaline, but on presence. And then, unhurriedly, he told her he had met someone. Someone serene, who listened to him slowly, who looked at him gently. Someone who didn't need euphoria to stay. And Laura felt her chest tighten. As if, for the first time, what she had done had real consequences. As if everything was falling apart for the second time. But there was more. And what came next, she never could have imagined. Daniel looked into her eyes and, with gentle firmness, asked if she remembered the girl who lived upstairs, the one who always came down with books, who smiled and returned quickly. Laura nodded, a little confused. He then told her that she was the cousin of the therapist he started seeing after everything happened. He said that for months, he went to therapy trying to understand where he had gone wrong. Trying to rebuild his self-esteem, trying to separate love from pain. And that, in the process, the therapist's cousin appeared once or twice by chance, offering coffee while he waited. That they talked. That they developed a discreet, respectful friendship. And that, one day, she showed him something. Daniel paused for a moment. His eyes, until then steady, wavered. Laura frowned, uncomprehending. It was then that he pulled a carefully folded sheet of paper from his pocket. He handed it to her. It was a photo. A photo of herself. Sitting in a cafe. Laughing. Facing the man she'd kissed. With her hand on his. With the look she'd never given Daniel again. The photo had been taken weeks before the company dinner. Laura gasped. She asked how he'd gotten it. He replied that the girl upstairs had seen her with the man several times. He didn't know who he was, but when he saw the scene, he took a picture. He didn't want to get involved, but when he saw Daniel devastated after dinner, he decided to show it. Laura put her hand over her mouth. She wanted to say something, but the words refused to come. Daniel then added, he said it wasn't the kiss that hurt. It was knowing the betrayal had existed long before. That there had been lies, omissions, manipulation. That she had set it all up, that she had time to stop, to confess, to ask for help. But she chose to hide it. He said that in that moment, he understood it wasn't just about betrayal. It was about choice. And she chose to lie, day after day. And finally, Daniel told her what had most destabilized her. He said that, during months of therapy, he discovered he was emotionally ill. That he was self-denying, that he carried the sole responsibility for keeping the marriage together. That he could no longer see his own limits. And that only after everything fell apart did he begin to see himself again. Laura then asked, her voice broken, if he still loved her. Daniel took a deep breath. He said that love like that doesn't fade. That he would always cherish her. But that the love he had built with such care was no longer hers. That it now belonged to someone who arrived after the fire. And that, ironically, it was this new woman who helped him find the ashes and decide what was worth rebuilding. Laura, defeated, stood up. She looked around. The home she destroyed was now just a place too clean, too impersonal. She walked to the door, but before leaving, she turned and said she'd never be able to love anyone again the way she loved him. Daniel nodded, without vanity. He simply said that she needed therapy too. And that perhaps, one day, she could learn to love someone, and herself, without having to destroy them in the process. Laura left. And for the first time in a long time, she knew what loneliness was. True loneliness. The kind that isn't the absence of people, but the absence of place. And there, in the hallway of the building that was once her home, she felt the bitter taste of what she had lost. But what she didn't yet know, was that fate sometimes holds one last lesson. One that comes when there's no turning back. One that would reveal that losing Daniel was just the beginning. Daniel didn't return to the apartment immediately. After closing the door behind Laura, he stood before the wood, still vibrating with the pent-up force of what had just happened. The silence that settled inside was unlike any other he'd ever known. It wasn't empty, it was definitive. It was closure. He walked to the balcony and watched the street below, where cars passed by, unaware that someone's life had come to an end. He felt a slight relief in his shoulders, as if a weight had finally been lifted that wasn't his. There was nothing more to say between them. Nothing to explain. Nothing to wait for. But there was still one last conversation pending. Not with the past, but with the present. With the one who, without haste, without noise, without demands, had found in him a space to cultivate another kind of love. Hours later, the doorbell rang. It was her. Soft eyes, calm steps, a serenity that seemed designed to contrast with the chaos Laura had left behind. She entered unhurriedly, as if respecting the space but not afraid to occupy it. Daniel hugged her firmly, with a gratitude that didn't need to be verbalized. They sat on the sofa, and for a few minutes, they said nothing. There was comfort in that stillness. When he finally told her Laura had shown up, she wasn't surprised. She simply listened, with the same gentleness he always listened to her. Daniel told her everything. From the photo to the last words spoken at the door. She simply held his hand and, looking into his eyes, asked if he needed time. Daniel shook his head. He said the time he needed had passed. That now, what he wanted was to live. But to live truthfully. With someone who understood that love isn't suffocating, nor running away, nor keeping quiet. It's remaining. Even when the other person is silent. Even when the world outside offers distractions disguised as passion. In the following days, Daniel felt a strange lightness. As if his heart were learning to beat again, but at a different rhythm. He began to rediscover his own routine with new eyes. He walked slower, paying attention to details that had previously gone unnoticed. The coffee seemed hotter. The mornings felt longer. The music felt more intense. He began writing in an old notebook, something he hadn't done since adolescence. He put fragments of what he felt there. Not about Laura. Not about the pain. But about what came after the pain. About the silent rebirth that sometimes comes when everything seems over. Meanwhile, Laura was sinking into her own absence. The world seemed to have faded. Friends disappeared. Family, though present, didn't quite know how to welcome her without judgment. The days dragged on. He returned to work mechanically, dull, without thirst. He tried going out with other people, laughing, dancing, but nothing felt real. He felt like someone who had lost the lead role in his own story and was now just a supporting character in other people's lives. He began attending therapy sessions. At first, he tried to justify himself, blaming fate, circumstances, boredom. But over time, his defenses fell. He began to recognize that his thirst for novelty was actually a deep fear of facing himself. That his escape to another man wasn't desire, but denial. And that the betrayal hadn't begun with the kiss, but long before, when he began denying himself the right to be vulnerable with the one who truly loved her. In one of the sessions, the therapist asked if she had written a letter to Daniel. Laura said no. That she didn't know what to say. The therapist then suggested, write even without sending it. Sometimes, what isn't read by the other still needs to be said by us. And she did. For an entire night, he poured onto the pages everything he'd never had the courage to say. He confessed his flaws, his fears, the admiration he still felt, the shame of having hurt someone so sincere. But, above all, she confessed the pain of realizing that what was once hers, was no longer. That he had become another man. One she didn't know. One who was now strong enough to choose peace, even if it meant leaving behind the one he'd once loved most. Life went on. Months later, Daniel was invited to a charity event hosted by the company where he still worked. It was a formal dinner, with speeches, fundraisers, and reunions. At first, he hesitated to go. But his partner encouraged him. He said he was ready. That he was no longer running from the past. He arrived elegant, discreet, and accompanied. And it was impossible not to notice the stares as he entered the room. Some whispered. Others simply watched. And then, between a glass of wine and a conversation, he saw her. Laura was across the room. Alone. Elegant, but reserved. Her eyes met his. She gave a shy smile. He simply nodded, as if recognizing someone who was once important but is now only a memory. Later, as the event drew to a close, Laura approached. She excused herself. Daniel's new companion smiled and gently stepped aside, leaving them alone. Laura took a deep breath. She said she didn't mean to disturb him. She just wanted to thank him. For their last conversation. For the way he handled everything. She said she was trying to be better. That she didn't expect anything. That was all she wanted to say. Daniel looked at her serenely. And said he was happy she was seeking this. That he hoped she would find herself again. That everyone deserved the chance to rebuild, even if it was from scratch. Laura smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. Before walking away, she asked, almost in a whisper, if he was happy. He replied, I am. And not for what I have, but for what I no longer carry. On the way home, his partner asked if he was okay. Daniel smiled and said yes. That he felt light. That, for the first time, the memory no longer hurt. That now he knew, some losses aren't the end. They're the beginning. And that true love, the kind that endures even when everything falls apart, can indeed be reborn. But sometimes, it's reborn elsewhere. In another's eyes. In other hands. And while the city slept outside, Daniel closed his eyes with the certainty that life, however hard, always rewards those who choose to love wholeheartedly. And that losing someone who didn't know how to stay, was never a true loss. It was deliverance. And it was time to move on. Because love, his love was now peace. That night of the charity event had left Daniel with something difficult to define. It wasn't relief, nor satisfaction, or vanity. It was a raw understanding that certain closures don't come with slammed doors or pierced screams. They come with the peaceful silence of those who have overcome. It was also the first time he and Laura were in the same physical space after the breakup, and the eye contact between them brought no anger, no desire for retaliation, only an inevitable acceptance that what once existed was now in another dimension of time, accessible only through memory. In the days that followed, Daniel resumed his routine with ease. There was no longer a shadow of doubt, no anxiety. The relationship with his new partner, whose name, until then, was still a constant discovery, grew with firm, unhurried roots. She didn't question him about the past, but listened when he wanted to talk. And the most beautiful thing was that she never tried to take anyone's place, because she knew that true love doesn't compete. It transforms space. Laura, on the other hand, plunged into a painful process of self-discovery that brought more questions than answers. Her meetings with her therapist became more intense, less defensive. The sessions ceased to be excuses and became real reflections. She began to confront not only her infidelity but the emotional patterns that led her to act this way. For the first time, she spoke openly about her lifelong fear of being abandoned, her constant need for validation, her unconscious belief that true love could only exist if it was constantly tested. Gradually, she realized that she had cheated not for lack of love, but for lack of courage. The courage to bare herself before someone who loved her without demanding masks. And in the end, she betrayed the only person who would have accepted her every weakness as part of the whole. The moral dilemma that now imposed itself was more bitter than any social punishment. It was the dilemma of living with the knowledge that she had consciously destroyed something that could have been her only real chance at being loved wholeheartedly. She began writing frequently, not to Daniel, but to herself. She drafted letters that began with promises, then turned into confessions, and finally ended in silence. She kept them all in a wooden box, like someone collecting broken mirrors of a version of herself she never wanted to be, but ended up becoming. It was cruel to realize that the damage done far exceeded what had been done to her. She had been hurt on a deeper level. She had become someone who now needed to relearn how to walk without stumbling over her own guilt. Daniel, for his part, was beginning to perceive the new possibilities of love. He no longer sought all-consuming intensity, but connections that built it. The woman he was involved with didn't demand proof, didn't make promises. She simply offered her presence. Sometimes, a touch on the arm during dinner or a note forgotten in his pocket was enough to remind him that he was starting over from scratch, but with firmer foundations. Love, now, was subtle and mature. It took its time. It respected the silences and celebrated the small achievements. The complicity grew in everyday life, in the banal conversations, in the shared decisions, in the glances that met at the right time. And most importantly, for the first time, Daniel wasn't afraid to be himself. But not everything was linear. There were moments when old memories surfaced strongly, sometimes awakened by a song, a street, a smell. The longing wasn't for Laura, but for a version of himself that existed when he believed love was enough to save everything. And it was in this internal confrontation that he began to mature more solidly. He began to understand that true love also requires reciprocity, emotional presence, and daily choices. It's not enough to love someone who doesn't know how to care for the love they receive. And there's no nobility in continuing to insist where one is devalued. The dilemma now was different: how to forgive himself for having allowed love to be neglected for so long. Because even though he was the betrayed party, Daniel blamed himself for not having noticed the signs, for having believed too much, for having stayed when there was no turning back. Laura, for her part, began to feel Daniel's absence in the most unlikely places. Not just at home, but in cafes, bookstores, and in the playlists they once shared. She began to realize that the love he offered was unusual, irreplaceable. He saw her even when she tried to hide. He listened to her even when she said stupid things. He respected her even when she forgot to respect herself. And that was what hurt the most, realizing that kind of love doesn't come twice. She could fall in love again, she could try to start over, but that specific look, that caring manner, that meaningful silence, those were gone forever. And then came the true weight of the aftermath. Not the pain of being left, but the pain of knowing she'd lost what can't be found again. Daniel began making plans. Not big, not far-fetched. Real plans. He wanted to travel with his new partner, explore small towns, sit on park benches, live at a slower pace. He wanted to make everyday life sacred, as he had always dreamed. For the first time, he imagined a future where he wouldn't have to carry anyone, just walk alongside. He started taking photography classes, something he'd always wanted to do but never had the time for. He captured landscapes, unfamiliar faces, urban details. He discovered that behind the lens, he could capture what he had so long failed to see in himself: beauty, depth, clarity. Meanwhile, Laura found herself facing a new reality. She was no longer the woman sought after at events, nor the center of attention. She began to notice that the admiration she once received was a reflection of the man walking beside her. Daniel was discreet, but his presence gave her a kind of quiet prestige. Without him, she discovered how accustomed she had become to being elevated by being next to someone admirable. And now, without that reflection, she had to sustain herself with only her suit. And she no longer knew how much of that was enough. It was on a gray Sunday, one of those when the city seems asleep, that Laura, walking alone down a street in the old town, saw Daniel across the sidewalk. He was holding the hand of the woman who was now part of his life. They were laughing at something silly while sharing an ice cream. Daniel's gaze was light. There was no longing, no discomfort. Only peace. Laura didn't have the courage to approach. She watched from afar, with a dry tightness in her chest, like someone watching their own story being told by other authors. And there, alone in the cold, she understood once and for all that loving someone and losing them by choice is a pain that cannot be overcome, only learned to bear. That same night, Daniel received a letter. There was no return address on the envelope, but the handwriting was unmistakable. He recognized it immediately. He sat in the armchair, took a deep breath, and read it. There were no apologies, nor any desperate declarations. It was a mature outburst, a kind of final confession. Laura said she had come to understand, over time, that his love wasn't exaggerated, as she thought, but deep. That his quiet demeanor was his way of showing care. That the silences weren't absence, but pure presence. And that now, she knew that kind of love was rare. She said she was rebuilding herself and that she wanted him to be happy, even if it meant never crossing paths again. Daniel closed the letter with slightly teary eyes, not from pain, but from respect. He stood, walked to the window, and stared at the sky for a few minutes. He felt like this was the last page of a book already written. And like every well-told story, the ending needed to be dignified. Not dramatic. Not vengeful. But true. And although there was nothing left to rekindle, the silent farewell between the two had finally been said. Now, there was only one final chapter left. The final resolution. The choice that, even unspoken, would carry the greatest lesson. The letter remained in a drawer that Daniel rarely opened, not out of contempt, but because he understood that some things, even when forgivable, don't need to be revisited. Laura's writing was mature, melancholic, and although he hadn't felt anger or resentment, he didn't feel the need to respond. It was an honest ending. Reading those words had been like hearing an ancient echo coming from a place he no longer lived. The guilt no longer lived there, the pain no longer lived there, the love, at least that love, no longer lived there either. Respect remained, which, for Daniel, was the noblest kind of closure. But life didn't stop because of the past. And there, between mornings that became lighter and nights filled with new conversations, he built a new way of inhabiting love, of recognizing himself in other eyes, of making room for other memories. It was an autumn afternoon that he decided to take his new partner to explore the coast where he used to vacation with his parents as a child. It was a simple beach, with fine sand and a calm sea. The place still held the scent of childhood, the muffled sounds of waves, and the warm wind that seemed to speak. Walking there with someone new by his side wasn't easy at first. He felt almost indebted to the past. But when he saw her running along the sand, laughing, her hair flowing in the wind, he realized his heart wasn't divided. He had transformed. He was no longer the man he once was, and so he didn't need to live with the guilt of experiencing something new in the same old setting. Love didn't replace. It reinvented itself. It was like taking the same road and finding completely different landscapes. The path was familiar, but the destination was different. That night, they sat by the sea with a thin blanket around their shoulders and cheap wine in a thermos. She rested her head on his shoulder and said she'd never felt so safe with anyone. Daniel looked at her silently. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he understood that security isn't promised, it's built. And in that moment, I knew I was on the right path. There was no rush to seal this new love with rings or papers. But there were plans. There was desire. There was a care born not from the need to prove something, but from the freedom to simply choose to be there, day after day. That was the difference. Now, he was with someone who chose to stay even without reason, even without urgency, even on ordinary days. A few weeks later, Daniel was surprised by a call from Laura's father. The voice on the other end was firm but gentle. He said he didn't want to cause any discomfort but thought it was only fair to talk. Daniel hesitated. He considered refusing, but something in his conscience made him accept. They met at a discreet coffee shop, away from familiar eyes. The meeting was brief but memorable. The man in front of him was visibly older than he remembered. His well-groomed gray beard contrasted with his tired eyes. He apologized if he was bothering him, but said Laura spoke of Daniel with great respect. He said he'd seen her change in recent months, that she was sincerely remorseful, that she was trying to rebuild her life more honestly. But the focal point of the meeting wasn't her. It was him. Laura's father wanted to say something he'd long held in his heart. She said that, throughout their marriage, she'd always admired Daniel, even if she didn't express it much. She said she'd rarely seen someone so silently upright, and that perhaps she'd never expressed the gratitude she felt for how he treated her daughter for so many years. He said he wasn't there to ask for reconciliation, much less forgiveness. I just wanted to say, as a father, that I recognized the value of the man who was once part of his family. Daniel listened calmly. He thanked her sincerely. And in that moment, he understood that even broken bonds can leave traces of respect when the story is lived truthfully. He left that conversation with his heart even more firmly set on the path he was heading. The visit from the past no longer shook him, it simply reminded him that loving wasn't a mistake. The way he was treated, yes, but loving had never been his fault. In the following days, life returned to its natural rhythm. Small rituals became symbols of a new stage: grocery shopping on Saturday mornings, cooking together on Sundays, walking to her favorite bookstore midweek just to buy a new bookmark. Ordinary life was now extraordinary because it was shared with ease. There was no longer any fear of being left behind because it was predictable. Quite the opposite. Predictability now felt like comfort. A calm, mature, solid love. A love that didn't require proof or extreme sacrifices. Just presence. Laura, for her part, decided to move to another city. Not out of cowardice, but because she understood she needed a real fresh start. Carrying all the places they once shared was a constant reminder of what he'd lost. And although she didn't want to run away, she felt the need to create new landscapes, where she could find herself without being constantly plagued by memories. Before leaving, he sent Daniel one last message. It wasn't an attempt at rapprochement. It was a warning. He said he was leaving, that he wanted him to continue being happy, and that he now understood that love isn't enough when we don't know how to care for it. That the things lost through ego, pride, or distraction return as an absence that can never be filled. Daniel read the message sitting at the kitchen table, with the morning sun streaming through the curtains. He didn't reply. He just closed his phone and looked out the window. Sometimes, saying nothing is the best way to end a story. And there, in that silence, he sealed the last page of a chapter that, finally, closed without a sound. That same week, he received a wedding invitation from a close friend. It would be held at a winery, with only a few guests. He asked his partner if she wanted to go, and she, with that smirk he adored, said yes. They traveled by car, listening to old songs and exchanging confidences. During the ceremony, Daniel watched the newlyweds attentively. He remembered his own wedding, everything he believed in back then, the promises he made. But instead of pain, he felt gratitude. Because even after being betrayed, even after losing himself for a time, he had managed to rediscover his own capacity to love. When the music started and the couple opened the dance floor, he offered his hand to the woman beside him. She accepted without hesitation. They danced slowly, their bodies pressed together and the complicit silence of those who know they're in the right place. There was no need to promise anything. They were already fulfilling their promises. Later that night, as they settled into their room at the inn, she turned to him and asked if it still hurt. Daniel, with his eyes closed and a half-smile, replied that it didn't. He said that pain, when left unattended, learns to go away. And that now, what he carried was only learning. She touched his face with her fingertips and told him she was happy to be part of this new chapter. He held her hand and replied that it was more than that. That she wasn't just the continuation. She was the new beginning. That morning, they fell asleep between clean sheets, discreet laughter and a feeling of peace that could not be explained, it could only be felt. And although the story with Laura was over, its lesson remained. Because love, when betrayed, can even die. But how we deal with loss, defines who we become afterward. Life doesn't teach with words. It teaches with consequences. And Daniel, finally, had learned. Time has a silent way of sealing destinies. Sometimes it heals, sometimes it simply settles the pain in corners where light doesn't reach so easily. In Daniel's case, time wasn't just an ally, it was a bridge. A crossing between ruin and reconstruction. In the months that followed Laura's last message, his life took shape with the firmness of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The woman by his side didn't hold him back for traces of the past, and he, in return, no longer carried emotional burdens. Together, they lived not in expectation, but in surrender. Their connection solidified into something solid, everyday, but no less profound. She knew him with her eyes. She knew when he needed silence, when he craved space, and also when her smile meant more than words could express. Daniel, in turn, had learned to love without losing sight of himself. He no longer dissolved into anyone. He no longer begged for permanence. He was whole. And being whole, after having been torn apart, was his greatest victory. It was on a spring morning that he made a decision that had long been brewing. He asked his partner to marry him. But the proposal wasn't made with spectacle, nor in front of crowds, nor against cinematic backdrops. It was made on the porch of his house, between a cup of coffee and the soft light of the morning sun. She looked at him in surprise, smiled with a calm glow, and accepted with a lingering kiss. There was no rush to announce it to the world. It was a promise made in silence, in intimacy, in the lightness of two hearts that finally knew the value of peace. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Laura continued to face the reflection of her own choices. She had left her old job, severed ties with some friends, and, above all, cut herself off from the versions of herself that contributed to the collapse of her own story. She now lived in a modest apartment, far from the center, where few people recognized her. It was a more discreet, simpler, but strangely more honest life. She began teaching creative writing at a cultural center and, in her free time, wrote short stories based on pain she now knew intimately. She didn't romanticize guilt, but studied it. She didn't ask for mercy, but reflected on the reasons she had destroyed what she had. Over time, she understood that there was no fixing everything. Certain wounds don't heal to restore what was. They heal only to stop the blood from continuing to flow. And, among these scars, one truth remained: she would never love anyone the way she loved Daniel. But she would also never be the woman capable of sustaining that love. Not then. Not with the emotional maturity that only came after everything turned to dust. One day she returned to her old neighborhood. Not to try to reconnect, but to search for a memory she had left behind. She sat on a bench in the square near the building where they had lived and watched children running, couples walking hand in hand, elderly men talking about life. It was a common, almost banal scene, but it provoked an almost physical pain in her. She saw there a life that could have been hers. A gift she herself had made impossible. She didn't cry. The tears had dried long ago. But she felt a kind of emptiness that was crueler than the pain. An emptiness full of awareness. Full of lucidity. The kind of silence that sets in when you can no longer go back, or pretend you weren't the one who turned out the lights. A few weeks before Daniel's wedding, one of their old mutual friends, someone who had maintained a neutral stance amidst the entire rupture, ran into Laura by chance. They chatted for a few minutes. Noticing the change in her, he mentioned that Daniel was about to get married. Laura thanked him for the information with a restrained smile. She didn't ask who the bride was. She didn't want to know where it would be. She didn't try to appear superior. She simply wished him happiness. And in that moment, even without knowing it, she completed the cycle. There were no more ties. There was no more waiting. Only the acceptance of what she had lost. And that, no matter how much the pain lessened, certain losses leave scars too deep to be ignored. It was the end of a chapter she herself wrote with hands trembling with her ego and her eyes blindfolded by illusion. Daniel's wedding was simple, as he had always wanted. Held in a small open field, surrounded by trees and soft music, with few people, many smiles, and almost no formality. There were no long speeches, just glances that said it all. As he looked at the woman before him at the makeshift altar, he felt he was experiencing something he never imagined possible, loving again, with more maturity, more freedom, more truth. It wasn't about replacing anyone. It was about allowing himself to continue. Of recognizing that life goes on even after the worst setback. And, if allowed, it can blossom again, stronger, more beautiful, purer. When the vows were exchanged, he held her hands tightly and said he promised not only to love, but to remain when the world screamed. He promised to listen even to the silences. He promised not perfection, but presence. She, moved, said she would love him with open eyes. That she wouldn't place him on a pedestal, but beside him, where he belonged. She promised to build, day after day, without haste, without pressure, but with truth. The applause was discreet, the tears contained. But in that field, between the trees and the wind, something was sealed, the certainty that love, when well cared for, is shelter. Not prison. Not conflict. But home. And as their world rearranged itself into new contours, Laura, sitting alone in her small apartment, finished a short story. The last in a short book she would self-finance. It was the story of a man who loved too much, was betrayed, rebuilt, and, in the end, loved as he deserved. It wasn't exactly about Daniel. But it was, yes, about her. It was the apology she never knew how to say out loud. It was her way of acknowledging that she lost the love of her life not by accident, but by choice. And that the consequences of this were eternal. She submitted the original for publication, and as she closed her laptop, she looked out the window. The world moved on. And she would move on too. But with the knowledge that she would never be the same again. Love, when betrayed, doesn't disappear. It transforms. Sometimes into heartache, sometimes into silence, sometimes into art. Daniel chose to transform his into a new beginning. Laura, into reflection. They both followed different paths, but each was marked by a crossroads that changed everything. A choice made in a moment of weakness had irreversible consequences. And that's how life works. There are no shortcuts to fixing what you destroy carelessly. If you've made it this far, comment now on what you thought of this story. Which part touched you most? Which character did you understand most? Tell us your opinion. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this, which touch, hurt, teach, and heal. This story leaves us with a clear and cruel reflection: betrayal is not just a momentary choice. It is a decision that reverberates throughout the lives of both the betrayer and the betrayed. It destroys homes, breaks trust, and destabilizes futures. And, most importantly, it destroys the chance of true love, one that could last a lifetime, if only it had been respected. Here on the channel, we don't support any kind of betrayal. On the contrary, we show the price it costs. Because true love means resisting the urge to run away and having the courage to stay when it would be easier to betray. The story ends, but the lesson, that remains forever.